Thanks, Erin, and hi, everybody. It's always great to see you. And, Erin and I, when we were waiting for all of you, we took a look at the headlines from a year ago today. And at that time, we were all looking at what was happening in New York City. They had about 700 deaths. And when we think about what's happened since, one of the things that I want you to know is that, the sort of social safety net services that you've been providing, we've been doing this survey for 12 years, and it was stunning what you were all dealing with and how creative and nimble and quick you were to try and turn things around, figure it out. And we know that it was just a tsunami of changes. And unlike a lot of the programs and services that Erin just talked about, this one really is what you tell us about what's been happening. So a little bit of context, you should know a little about our sector, right? Of the 40 or so million people that live in California, 31% of those living at or below the poverty level are living in LA County. That was before the pandemic, before the job losses. So when we talk about what's been happening in our sector over this past year and kind of what's coming up next, unlike a lot of other industries, our sector saw demand grow at, in some cases, 400%. Especially, for those that were in low wage jobs, hourly jobs, high density populations and housing, Black and brown communities, historically underserved communities. We know that you were having to pivot quickly to just, I was talking to someone this morning about this is one time when we saw mission creep for all the right reasons, which was they need it, we're going to do it. So, but what emerged in looking at what you were telling us, there were a couple of kind of broad themes that you're going to see throughout the results here about either can we survive or can we keep up? And for those of you that took the time, we asked a lot of questions this year to try and get a sense of what you were dealing with and what was changing, because we were really experiencing through our consulting practice and our training programs, stories that you were telling us, and then some different stories that we were kind of hearing on the streets. And we wanted to make sure that we could unpack that. And so for those of you that took the time, we know it was a long, painful survey, and we saw some fatigue in there, but thank you to Eric and Maura and Erin and Lauren who helped create the document and then to turn the analysis into what you're going to see today. And for those of you that took the time to fill it out, this wouldn't have been possible if you didn't take the time. So thanks so much. Couple of things about who answered the questions. We were excited that we saw a really good representation from around the county, and then we saw a growing numbers of people in San Bernardino, the IE, San Bernardino, San Diego, but that most of LA County was represented, and that the spread of budget sizes and the sort of length of time that they've been in business was a pretty good spread. It did skew longer for organizations that have been in business for 20 years or more, if there was anything where it was a little bit heavier on one side or the other. But in terms of budget size, that's that bar at the bottom. So with that in mind, Erin, let's get to it. I think that our goal is to kind of take a look at how the current conditions are impacting your ability to achieve your mission. So we look at it from a couple of perspectives. What's happening on the finance side, on the staffing side, what's happening with your board, and then what you're seeing in terms of community need, and then how you're responding. So let's take a look at what you said. So one of the things that we saw, if you think about the last 12 months, was the very steep learning curve. When we think about the middle of March of last year, what we were hearing from people is, now what do? We've got to cancel our fundraiser, and we were counting on that. And then pretty quickly after that, it was, needing to learn about unemployment opportunities through the state of California, what the options were for furloughs. Food lines were starting to show up. The sort of next phase was what, new money was coming online, right? All of a sudden we learned about PPP loans, and you were telling us by this time last year, if you were going to be staying in place, where do I get PPE? And I didn't have a budget for that, right? So along the way, the sort of shifting remotely and what that meant for not just social justice, but for being able to continue to sustain services, and what you could do remotely and what you couldn't do remotely. And then, and this is just the first couple of months. By the time we got to early summer, what we started hearing from all of you is, my staff is so stressed and burned out. The toll of what's happening globally, what's happening personally, and the services they're trying to provide is just getting to be too much. So, and then as we talked about summer and fall, we started shifting some attention to the vaccine, and real confusion in many communities about, should we trust it? Will it be available? And what is the role of our sector in trying to make those services available to people? So we share that with you because if you're feeling fatigue, think about that. A year ago, we didn't know PPP was a thing, much less that we were going to have to buy a lot of it and retrofit our offices and train our staff. So with that in mind, let's move on to what comes next. So we have a question for you, and we want you to put something in the chat. How would you describe 2021 when you think about your organization in one word? Please put that in the chat.
Yep, not a ton of surprises here, but a nice mix between, challenging and transformative. It's kind of walking that line between hard and hopeful. I like that. Fake it till you make it.
And resilient and challenging and exciting and stimulating and exhausting. It's pretty much what we heard from all of you, which is all of the above. So let's go to the next slide. So, we did a poll in May of last year for some work that we were doing with the county, specifically around how the current conditions were impacting our industry. And in May, what you told us, about 20% of you expected to close by the end of 2020. When we asked the question again in September, 12% of you said that you didn't think you'd make it till the end of the year. We don't know what happened to those people. We don't know how many did close, how many figured it out. So let's go to some of the more specific ones. So when we asked you about staffing, some of you said, a pretty large percentage, 56% of you said that you were going to be cutting admin expenses. That's the sort of first and in our control kind of strategy that many people use. But what you'll see in the bar chart next to it is that there were other things going on. That some people were looking at professional development, some people were looking at hiring, adding staff. We saw both going on simultaneously. And what appeared pretty early was that if you were in one of the areas that was sort of frontline related to the pandemic and the crisis, so food, housing, mental health, what we saw is you had too much to do. What we saw simultaneously is if it was arts and culture, after school programs, things that did not seem so urgent and necessary, those were the organizations that were saying, I can't see us making our way through the end of the year, or we're going to be spending our reserves and hoping that we can get to 2021. So on to the next chapter there. So when we talked about financial uncertainty, when we asked you about your financial situation, 75% told us that they expected budget reductions this year. What you told us is that that looked like about 25% of your funding was in jeopardy. The financial reserves, I just mentioned to you, what we had many colleagues telling us that they were tapping their reserves to get through 2021, and they were much more nervous about tapping their reserves in 2020 and tapping their reserves in 2020 and concerned about 2021. And this one I wanted to really call out because I think there's a misperception that our sector is doing better than it is. You know, there was a lot of money coming in because of the federal dollars that were part of the economic recovery. So those forgivable loans sometimes make people's kind of financials for the last year look better. What we're hearing from a lot of leaders is that this notion of the 75% expecting a reduction, and I think we're going to have to, as a sector on the nonprofit leadership side, to make sure that we're kind of truing up this story, which is to say we got through last year because there were dollars that were moving online quickly, and those dollars are not as available in 2021, but the need hasn't stopped. So let's go to the next one. So, you know, we were again sort of struck by the idea of what was the change in demand since the beginning of the pandemic. 56% of you said that there was an increase, that you saw more than usual. And then you see, and we certainly experienced at CNM, you know, there was a portion of the population, while it was small, that was saying, no, nothing really hasn't changed for us, or that there was some bit of a dip. And then, but a really small slice that said not at all. So next slide. So on the, there were a couple of themes that emerged as we think about what you said was coming sort of high on the list. And some of this looks a little different than what we've seen in past years. Many of you might know that we started doing this poll at, when the recession hit in 2009. So we've been surveying you all since then. And it's very, we have never seen strategic planning be as high a number as we've seen in this survey, with 67% saying that's a priority or it's already underway. 77% of you are saying that it's underway and it's a priority. In terms, and this isn't so surprising, given how much of a transition we all had to make this past year, 60% of you have invested in technology. We think that part of that was moving everyone home, but we also know that some of you are saying that some of the things that moved virtually and some of the kind of what we asked for over the year about any silver linings in a new approach, that some of this was we're going to invest in new ways of doing business using virtual services and solutions. 50% said that marketing and new media became a priority this year. And there's another, I think, 23% that are saying that the planning is underway to invest in that. So this is a big one, the sort of telling your story, which kind of makes sense as you're trying to break through all the noise. But this role of how we tell our story, how we communicate with key audiences and grow that audience is growing. On the 71% of you are in the process of recruiting new board members. And this is where the DEI issues came up in board recruitment, that there was a real sensitivity around the idea of, as you think about who you're recruiting, does it reflect the community? Does it reflect your mission? And being very intentional about that. And then trying to navigate some of those hard conversations that have to happen. And then this number, which has been consistent over the last couple of years, and I always smile when I see this one because it reminds me of how optimistic our sector is. Every year you say we're going to find new sources of revenue, that we're going to find ways to either some new strategies for earned income, new grants, greater numbers of donations. Definitely though, that earned income line is growing, that people are looking at ways for more sustainable income that isn't dependent on the generosity of others. So let's go to the next one. So a couple of things that we see emerging in 2021, and we wanted to get some feedback from you in a minute. What we and all of us have felt, I think, is a bit of fatigue about, what we know is that organizations told us starting in around September, they couldn't keep up that pace of responding to everything that was coming up. That it wasn't sustainable, but it really was a time to start to think about what they were going to focus on going forward. What we also heard from philanthropy, who had assembled, hundreds of millions of dollars between many sources to focus on some of the most urgent needs around food and housing, and then even with some of the arts recovery money and sort of starting to settle back into what it was going to take to move on in a better way, healthier way. What we saw was fatigue, that people were tired of it, that they had to really think about, they couldn't keep investing at that level and that they were going to be pulling back. What we heard from you is a concern, as there was a strong signal from many, given so much emphasis on social justice, inequality, that there are still services to be delivered, and what is that going to mean for funding for the work that needs to be done simultaneously. The issue of government reimbursement, you all know in California, when we started the calendar year, minimum wage went up. What here in LA County, we've been talking for several years with the county, the state, and the federal government about overhead and reimbursement, and that conversation is heating up because what we've seen is a real link between the sustainability of organizations and how expensive the relationship is if you contract with the county, and the gap between the services they pay for and the dollars that you have to raise, either from philanthropy or from donors, to deliver services the county depends on. And certainly our residents depend on. And then lastly, how much, thanks, Chrissy. I feel strongly about this one. It sounds like you do too. And then lastly, on what you learned about what was possible virtually. I was really struck by, in some of the open-ended comments, how often you said you were surprised that when you were forced to try to move people home, that you were forced to try and figure out ways to deliver services to people, that there were some benefits and some new ways of doing business, and that sometimes expanded the numbers of people that could participate. Sometimes it meant there was some savings. There were some different approaches that had some real value that you're going to want to keep doing. So trying to not that all of those changes and adaptations, we wouldn't wish on any of us that they were forced on us the way that they were. But what you were telling us is that there were some silver linings, that there were some things that now you know that really are good for you and the people that you serve going forward. So we were curious on a couple of levels. I know this is kind of fire hose moment. We ran through these really quickly. And I was curious to learn a couple of things. Are there new practices or lessons that you think you're going to be using going forward that have been especially valuable? So I thought we'd like to see that in the chat. Yeah. One of the things that I didn't talk about too much, but we definitely saw it in the summertime. You guys that spent a lot of Fridays with us during our lunch and learns, you know that we brought in the county Department of Mental Health to talk about mental health. And what we heard from a lot of you was really creative ways to keep up morale, that you had to put a lot of time and energy and thinking into how to help people still feel connected to your organization and to each other, and had to take a pause sometimes to just find out how people were doing personally, given all this the stress that, you know, so many were facing in so many from so many different directions. Um, yeah, definitely on the mental health side. Um, Yeah, you guys also remind me that one of the things that we heard on sort of a happy note was that sometimes you got better board attendance because of virtual meetings, that they could fit it in. And that in some cases, because of the crisis, they felt more engaged. So good for you on that one. That's the upside. Um, yeah, not wasting time on the freeway. Yeah, I didn't mention, but one of the things that emerged by the fall was you had made some tradition, some some new solutions and approaches to fund development. You know, we heard a lot, and I told you it kind of started out with, now what do we do? We had to cancel our annual fundraiser. What we heard over the summer, there was kind of curiosity about how are others doing virtual fundraising, and by the fall, you guys were coming kind of the role models for lots of creativity and ways to get people engaged. Um, and I know a few of you really well in some of the work that you were doing, and I know that you got very creative and in fact grew your audience this year and grew your donor base. And when we talk about funder fatigue, one of the things on the philanthropy side, I had mentioned that they were saying it's not sustainable. On the individual donor side, what we've heard from you is that we're worried that while it was making news and they wanted to invest, how do we keep them involved and engaged and part of our mission going forward? So, in some cases that meant more of an investment in, growing your fund development staff, and part of that emphasis on marketing and communications and all that stuff. But yeah, glad to see lots of great examples of how you pivoted on the fund development and on fundraising side. And also what we've heard is some really fun things that are happening in the community, leveraging local chefs or local artists to get them involved, and that some of those kind of smaller, very different kinds of ways of um, getting people involved, you're going to stick with. I'm glad, Carlos, that you brought up the idea of not hitting deliverables, because I left that out. But during this window, one of the things that I wouldn't quite go all the way out on a ledge to say that there's been more trust-based philanthropy going on, because I think that's kind of a bit more rosy. But one of the things that we're really excited to keep tracking is, philanthropy did in many, many cases say, forget the reporting, forget the data, adjust the deliverables, the contract can shift its focus if you see a different need. And what we heard from many on the grant maker side is that it gave them a moment this fall to talk about why do they do some of the things that they do, and is some of that something that's going to stick going forward. And I think that, again, one of the things that I hope you take from this conversation is a real opportunity to use your voice with those program officers to talk about, what are we trying to do together, and what do you want your investment to accomplish, and what information would be most valuable. I think this is a moment in time where everyone's asking questions about what needs to stay the same and what needs to be different. And if you have thoughts on that, I think this is a good time to speak up. I think people are listening. So curious if you guys are thinking that, are there other topics that you want to learn about that we haven't covered? Vivian, I'm not sure I see the whole message. Concerned about local. Oh, oh, Marianne, yeah. Conversations with the county about reducing so much. That's a whole different conversation about, we have been talking with the county for the past year about the whole, and many of you have been part of focus groups that we've posted over the last couple months. So thank you for that. But one of the topics that is high on our priority list is to really look at what has been our sector's relationship with the county as a service provider and as a business. And from the beginning of the journey, how you find out about potential contracts to how you apply, how much paperwork and how much redundancy is in there, to how inconsistent some of the requirements are, through to the rate of reimbursement, through to why do we need so many audits, all the way to the end, to the pace that you get reimbursed or to start the job, and the sort of precarious place that organizations find themselves in if they're involved with the county, the state, or the federal government. But we've really been focused on LACAM. And I can tell you that we're very excited that the supervisors are very supportive of some of the, for those of us that just work hard every day, just modernizing to at least within this century, we would take that as a victory. And we're hoping that with some of the new federal recovery money that they can invest in some of that. But we'll be keeping you posted on that. We need your help. We need to keep the pressure on. We're asking for a systems change that crosses all of LA County, all missions, and that's an epic assignment, but we're excited to be doing that. So Genevieve, I see your hand up.
So yeah, I was just thinking about the idea of what needs to stay the same and what needs to change. And what comes to my mind is that it's really going to be a hybrid on all fronts. I think, I'm looking at what needs, in what ways are we going to keep some of the virtual engagement? We've experienced some of the same things with really great board attendance at board meetings. Even we've done some extra, kind of social things with the board that have been really successful. So I can imagine us moving to having a certain portion of our meetings be in person and a certain portion of our meetings be virtual. And then with staff, we've had so much staff that have been working from home very effectively. I mean, for me, saving 2 hours a day of driving is always a nice thing. And I think we're really going to be looking at how do we manage moving to a hybrid system where some of our staff is going to, ideally we want to bring people together some of the time, but we also want to keep some of the productivity and the quality of life that comes with being able to work from home. And I think it would be really interesting to hear from other folks how they're managing that. And as we move forward, maybe even have some training around how to manage this kind of new hybrid reality. I mean, same with events. We're planning all of our events pretty much for 2021 to be virtual, even though we may be able to gather by the summer. And it's been so great in some ways. How do we keep a virtual aspect to events even when we bring back an in-person aspect? So I think hybrid is really going to be the model going forward for a lot of things.
It's so great that you bring that up, because one of the things that, and I'm curious how any of you are dealing with this, but one of the things that we've been thinking about at CNM for this summer is definitely how do we ask those questions about, with our, it's going to be a time, I think, for leaders to over communicate, to be asking their staff what they're worried about and what they're not worried about, what their board is liked about what's happened and what might be practices to keep going. We know that many people told us over the summer, fall, and now into the winter, how much they liked virtual events because there was less money going to catering and less time on all of those logistics, and just raise money and put it to work. So not that the just raise money is easy, but there's some things in there that I think in this time when we're really, there's such a sensitivity around, let's make sure that as many dollars as can be put to use to help people in such distress, that I think that the more I really do believe as leaders, we're going to have to over communicate for a while. And then even be thinking about, what does that mean to how you manage your staff remotely, how you keep people feeling part of something. I know I see Carrie, and then I saw Lisa. So Carrie, you want to go first and then Lisa next?
Hi, I'm Carrie Jackson Lewis. I'm a
Sure.
philanthropic consultant with California Philanthropic Consulting, and I used to be at CCF with a bunch of folks here who I'm well aware of. And thank you all so much for putting on this event. It's really useful and interesting to get the feedback from the survey that had gone out, and then actually forward looking for 2021. I'm with the Los Angeles Council of Charitable Gift Planners, and we're planning our Western Regional Plan Giving Conference, which is our Wisdom Wednesday start on the 21st, and then they go for 5 weeks, and then we have our conference in May. And in respect of thinking about these virtual events, I think I agree with, uh, our other speakers and Genevieve who've really talked about the balance between the convenience of the virtual setting and the ability to get speakers and other folks from all over the country who are certainly willing to share their time and their talent with us, which we couldn't have had before. The ability also to use this time to pivot and ensure that our speakers are more diverse, right? They're multicultural, they're coming from all over the country and from all these different fields to talk about plan giving, charitable gift planning, and how diversity, equity, inclusion are being sort of linked into the work that we do moving forward better than we have in the past, and how these three, the triple whammy of the pandemic and the racial reckoning, triggered by the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others, and the fractured political system, we're able to get folks to come in, talk about how that's affecting charitable gift planning and nonprofits in a way that I think is more comprehensive than we would have had in the past when we all went to a hotel in Orange County near Disneyland. Right, we
Right.
just couldn't get we
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
we just couldn't get everybody over there. So,
Sure.
but of course, then again, we're right, we couldn't do all that, right? But of course, we do miss seeing everyone in person. But I do think that, to Genevieve's point, that balance, that we're all looking for, I think is something that we should be doing a postmortem to say, okay, what do we keep go moving forward when everyone's vaccinated and we can be together, and what are some of the things that we have missed and need to continue to implement going forward.
Yeah, great points. Yeah, and sort of almost putting a weight to it, right? Where it's really important to be together, where it's less important to be together, and where the values are there. Yeah, thanks for that. Sorry I butchered your name.
Oh,
Um,
my pleasure, no worries.
Lisa, next up.
Oh, thanks, Regina. This has been wonderful. Another great report. I'm curious, we have seen on the fundraising side a pivot by funders to more unrestricted operating support, a relaxing of some of the guidelines and processes for reporting, a lot more flexibility than normal. So I'm wondering if you heard from folks whether they're hoping those will remain in place and not revert back to the old style of fundraising. What to do here, or anybody on this call can share it.
Happy to welcome anybody who wants to weigh in. Yes, I would say the thing that we heard from everyone is how much they needed flexibility to make decisions.
Okay.
And then to do, I mean, that is one of the practices that I think, based on the feedback we heard last summer and fall, we hope that one sticks,
Good.
And the other piece that I've been sort of struck by, and this is Regina, this isn't survey, sometimes I hear a little bit of, but we don't want to loosen up on sort of accountability. So I think we have to be careful about, we want flexibility, but we still are clear about what we want to accomplish with those dollars, just not in such a linear way, right? In a more broad way. So I'd be curious how you guys are experiencing that issue.
Because Regina, I think it's based on what you're saying. You need to communicate this to SoCal grant makers, and all of us need to communicate this. Otherwise, we risk it reverting back to the old style. Okay, here are the reporting requirements. We're going to just do project grants. We're going to do this. And we certainly would like to see foundations open up their doors again and not all be invitation only, which is the other thing that happened during the pandemic.
Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up, Lisa. I am very worried that, there's fatigue and then they go back to old because it's familiar. And this is such a time to sort of push for fresh thinking and things that, practices that are going to be more impactful and meaningful. And I've been so struck by how often in our work with the county, what we've heard is the nonprofit sector is too nice. You guys don't speak up. You just do it. You're really happy to be able to provide those services to the community. And so it is why we started with the data point about if 30% of the poverty in California lives in our county, they are depending on the people on this call to figure things out and make services available to them. So the more that we can go in as an employer and as a voice, not simply for the mission and being so grateful that there are county dollars available, but to really talk about the impact that we make in communities with residents that are actually paying the bills here. So not that I feel
I think you're right, Regina. I think part of that story is that we do have to be honest. And I will say that we have some wonderful reputations at Westside Food Bank with some of our donors, foundation donors, and there's folks out there that are in the foundation community. I'm thinking of Parsons and Weingart and others that are really leading the charge on being honest about what it takes to do this work, talking about the Nonprofit Finance Fund and the need for full cost funding. But I think it's really on us too, to, as you say, stop being so nice and to really talk about what it takes for us to do those kinds of reports. When you're blessed enough to have, a lot of different foundations fund you, but each one of them has a very complicated reporting structure with, slightly different questions that want you to answer in different ways. And there's character limits and there's all these things that you have to do. I think we have to be honest about what that costs us and how much time it takes us, and to be willing to risk that, and some foundations do put it out there. I think, Parsons is a good example. How can we do things differently? What feedback do you have? If they ask for it, especially, let's not be afraid to give honest feedback. And even if they don't ask for it, if you can start to have those conversations on your site visits, if you can start having those conversations with your program officers at the foundations, I think it's really helpful. I'm a parent of young adults, and I remember doing the Common App for college applications. And, there is something out there in GuideStar that's very similar, where you can put a lot of your information out there and then have just a few specific questions tailored for foundations. I think the more we can tell that story about the amount of time and energy and work and hours and the dollars that it costs to pay our staff to engage in that work, the more we can make the case. It's just like the money not going to the caterers. Do you really want to force our nonprofit staff to spend hours and hours and hours on basically answering the same questions in 10 different ways? I think we have to be more honest.
I'm looking at this comment from Carlos saying about being nice. Sometimes there's a fear that they're going to offend funders. And I get that. I represent some foundations, and I've had people give feedback. There is a difference, though, between somebody who comes out swearing and battering you over the head over what, and there are people out there who will just beat you over the head about your process. And then there's the people who just very politely say, I hope you don't mind, but I'd like to share our experience with the process. I get that a lot with one of my foundation clients. And I actually appreciate the feedback. It makes us better. It makes us, we have always shifted our process based on the feedback we hear. And it really does make us a stronger philanthropic, partner when we hear that kind of honest feedback. As long as it's not someone taking it personally or somebody who's really abrasive or really trying to be negative and attacking you, all they're saying is, all you have to say is, look, we went through the process. We're grateful for the opportunity, but here are some things we think you should know about. That's it.
Well, I'm so struck by the idea that they can't know if we don't tell them. you know. And I remember a couple of, maybe a year or two ago, it's all kind of a blur, but we were going after some money from a lot of different sources, and one source needed 100 words and one source needed 10,000 words, but I didn't really have anything different to say, right? I said it in 100, I can say it in 10,000, but it's really not different, right? It just took me a lot more time to write more words so that they didn't think I didn't care. It was such a game. And I always tell funders that, like, does anyone read those 10,000 words? That's a lot of reading, and if not, let's not do it anymore. But so I'm curious if there are other topics that you guys feel are really important that we either speak up on or that we think about going forward. Sounds like, Lori, you're thinking that yes, we should be speaking up on the funder side and the trust-based philanthropy side, and really looking at ourselves as a partner, less of a vendor, maybe.
I think it's really appreciate you thinking about what it is nonprofits need to, from organizations like yourself that can be that voice, whether it's, just here among us or, when you're looking at influencing legislation and things like that. It's really, we're really grateful to have your voice in these conversations. And I think one of the things that would be useful is to talk more about these structures in ways that don't, beat anyone over the head. But if we are really talking about equity and inclusion and diversity, if we're talking about dismantling racism and being anti-racist in our structures and ensuring that nonprofits who are making an impact are getting the funding that they should have, we can really talk about the structures themselves that exist that either discourage that kind of diversity or in fact continue to support and uplift sort of the white supremacist structures that we're living with, right? So this is not to say that the folks who are sitting in some of these structures are bad people and no one wants to hit anybody over the head. But if you walk into a room that has cigarette smoke in it, you're going to breathe that cigarette smoke. So if you are living in this country and are working in this country, then you have to take a look, a really good look at the structures that exist and look at the effects of it and say, okay, so let's go to some root causes. What can we do to better serve the nonprofits that we work for? Some of those things would be to do, as Genevieve so rightly said, let's do a common app, right? So that smaller nonprofits who don't have a grant writer and a this and a that, they can use the information that they've provided in another application in a simple and easy way. Let's ensure that it's not just invitation only, because some of the board members don't play golf, right, with some of these other folks, at these other foundations. Let's ensure that what we're doing, that our internal structures are structures that support inclusivity from all kinds, from all regions, rural, urban, folks of BIPOC serving in BIPOC-led organizations and other organizations. If we can look at the structures, then we're not saying anyone is a bad person. We're saying, you know what, these structures are not allowing us to give effect to our mission. And so what can we do to better support our role, right, as folks who are here to help people as nonprofit funders? So I would love to see what kind of shift we can do as a group of nonprofits to say, together, these are the steps that we can take, and here's how we inform our funders as to what our needs are and how we can be better partners in giving effect to our missions.
I'd be curious if you guys will just do a thumbs up or not. We're not gonna, if this is a topic that you feel comfortable bringing up to funders. I know, in the chat, some people felt it was kind of an awkward position to be in. I'm curious, as we think about how we can speak up, where the line is on that for people. That's kind of not in your wheelhouse, or potentially something to think about. Oh, but it just occurred to me, I'm not sure if we'll see it, Aaron, if they're not, I just have their names. I may not see it. I'll just pretend
a few thumbs up and hearts, and yeah. There's another good question that Suzanne left in the chat. The state of mergers. I think in the last year, we've talked at different times about partnerships and mergers and strategic alliances. And now I'm realizing it wasn't a top line data point in this study. So I'm curious if you remember if there was a question on that, or just kind of where the wind is blowing.
Yeah, you know what? There was. I'm glad you guys brought that up. There were a couple things around that. The one thing that I thought was pretty cool, and it just was another example of innovation that was going on throughout the year as you guys tried to figure out how to respond. What we saw in some cases was organizations that had too much to do were talking to organizations that didn't have as much to do to tap staff. And start to create partnerships that could hire people, keep people working, all of that stuff. There isn't like a growing, tsunami. So I'm like, on one end, there's not this big voice for let's merge, but there are more and more, thanks, I think, partly to the NSI and partly the Nonprofit Sustainability Initiative, and partly because so many of you are working in partnership with others. What you told us in the survey is that you were really looking hard at reducing admin costs. And usually mergers are not driven by dollars. What you've told us over the last 10 years is that mergers are driven by mission, that you want to expand your reach, that you start to see some benefits to combining. And then there's it's usually not a savings in the way that people anticipate. In fact, it can be expensive for a while. But that there are some real impact reach opportunities in creating a merger that's more formal. But I'm kind of curious, what we started to see is, and what we saw last time with the recession, is there's a point in the conversation where we can cut admin costs, and then we start to get to bone, and then we've got to look at other options. And so I'm really curious to see where people sort of land in another 6 months or so, about when we've sort of seen what happens with 2021 and all of the ways that people, I've just been really struck by, I don't know that anybody knows, quite yet what just happened. I think we're all trying to figure it out and then see what it means going forward, which is why we were so curious to ask a lot more questions this time, and then see if we can keep tracking it. What we know, though, on the other end of it, is that for organizations that are really feeling vulnerable, they are not a good merger candidate, that it's just too precarious. One of the things that did show up in the survey, and it was only one question, was, for organizations that are thinking they're in trouble, what the smart strategy is are there any programs that could live someplace else? And then be looking for a partner to acquire that part, but it wouldn't really be a merger in the way that you're thinking about it, I think. Marcia, you talked about the community coalition and digital organizing and getting more members involved. Is there anything that you want to talk about there that, I mean, it sort of hits on some of what a lot of people have been talking about broader engagement in different ways and strategies that emerged this year?
Well, one, stepping into the space to make sure that members had technology was key. And so we were able to do that by partnering with the Brotherhood Crusade to get not only laptops and hotspots for families, but also for members, which was really important. But we also held trainings on Zoom. And so what we found, like at some of our campaigns, we had 150 people on Zoom calls. So we were able to literally continue to organize in the digital space, which was really it took us by surprise, but it was such a nice surprise. And so that's, we definitely want to continue to grow that muscle among our members and our community residents. But yeah, that's definitely a takeaway from this interesting period.
Right, right. Who would have thought, right? A year ago, and all the work you guys had to do to make it happen. Congrats on that. Well, I want to give you back the time if there's no more questions. That if you would, I have one last question, which is if there's anything that we didn't ask that we should ask as we think about the next couple times, what we think we're going to do as a heads up, when you guys get a email from us saying we just have a couple questions, we promise the next couple will just be a couple questions, that it won't be as long. We're very clear that you have lots to do. And so we're going to make the next couple shorter for the rest of 2021, just to get a quick peek at what's going on with you guys. And then, I think I mentioned at the beginning that the part of this was so that we all know among ourselves what we're dealing with, that you're not alone in it, right? That others are dealing with this too. And here are different strategies that either many or not many are trying. And then also to make sure that we share with our friends in government, our friends on the corporate side, and our friends on the philanthropy side, that this is what they're telling us is really going on in real time. And that's why we call it a snapshot. This is a real-time picture of what they tell us is going on, so that they can make decisions at least on what we are hearing from you. So if there's anything that we didn't ask that you'd be curious about us asking, we'd certainly try to do that. And just really want to say thank you so much. It's always so fun to see who is available to share time with us and to hear what's on your minds. But for Erin and I that have been trying to figure out for the past year how to make sure that we make these hours useful for you guys, if there's anything that we can do that would be more beneficial, valuable at this point, we're open. We can be pretty nimble and bring people together. So always open to ideas. So feel free to either put something in the chat or to email us. You know where to find us. We're always here. We never close. Anyway, all right. We'll see you guys hopefully at the conference. Erin, anything I left out?
That was great. I just put a link to the conference in there, and yeah, this is what we're thinking about for the conference. A lot of these themes and these conversations are going to be continuing, both on the hybrid events, on funding. A lot of these questions are things we're digging into, and that people on this call will be speaking towards. Looking at you, Genevieve. So yeah, a lot of familiar faces will be there. And yeah, would love to know any other, anything else you'd like to know for these other surveys. As we mentioned, we definitely will be sending around the recording, the slides. We do have a one sheet ready that you can share as well. So that'll probably be beginning of next week. We just want to polish it up a little bit, but really appreciate you all spending your time with us. This has become such a great way to wind down our weeks over the last year, and just, stay connected with you all. So yeah, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you all for joining. Hope everyone has a great weekend.
Bye, everybody.